Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And this afternoon, we are going to talk about the fact of, we're going to look at geopolitics as usual, and we're going to look at the fact that the United States empire wants to see the likes of China outside of Jamaica and the Caribbean and the region at large. The United States is the reigning superpower of the world, and it evidently does not like to see any other competitor or any other strong global power. It does not want to compete with any other global power, including any power out of Europe or out of Asia or out of Africa. You must understand that the United States is not a friendly nation, whether or not it's Democrats who are in power or it's Republican, it is the same agenda. And many of us have not yet awoken to understand that fact. And even though I'm preaching it every day about, the fact that we cannot confide in either the Democrats or the Republican Party, people still continue to listen to the news, and they still continue to follow and suggest that this is what is that the United States is friendlier, is a greater ally, as it were, under the Democratic Party. In fact, the Gleaner this morning is giving this, sort of protestation, is asserting that Trump is this special president, and they have brainwashed the minds of Jamaicans and the people in the region that Trump is this candidate who is anti-democracy, while people like the likes of Obama's and the other people, they really treasure democracy and they are better candidates, even though they don't understand that it's different styles. However, the agenda is much the same, and we've got to understand that. Now, the editor of the Gleaner this morning, let me see, says here that Donald Trump's intention, they read the New York Times, which is also of the intelligence state, right, of the CIA and the FBI and all these intelligence organizations. So Donald Trump's intention, as the papers, the Gleaner here, the editorial is saying, as the New York Times put it this week, is to leverage America's economic strength to bully other nations to his preferred policy positions. But it's not his, it's the US's, the US military industrial complex, the US empire's preferred policy positions, which is the basis of Mr. Trump's threat, now deferred for a month, to impose a 25% tariff on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico, the United States' two biggest trading partners, ostensibly to force them to take action against illegal immigrants or migrants and the synthetic opioid fentanyl that cross the borders into the United States. He also complained rather about their trade surpluses with the United States. Now, as we suggested before, the United States realizes that it is weakening, that its global power, its global hegemony was weakening, I should say. Now, remember now that after the war in Iraq in 2003, that the United States started to weaken, because after the war in Iraq, then you had the war in Syria, the war in Libya, and all over the world, the United States was actually waging wars, particularly in the Middle East. So it weakened the empire significantly. Remember now that the same thing happened after World War II. The United States emerged as the most formidable nation in the world after World War II. The entire nations in Western Europe had been weakened and were on the verge of collapse, including the great and noble British Empire, right? And what happened afterwards? The United States was so arrogant, right, and was so self-confident that they decided that they would wage wars around the world, including in Asia, right, against Japan, against Korea. And what happened eventually? The US, and of course, we know Vietnam, the US started to weaken. And that is why it had to come off the gold standard and had to impose austerity on the rest of the world. And the United States would benefit from whatever austerity that would have been imposed in Jamaica or imposed in Chile or wherever the United States, through the use of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, decided to impose their austerity on. Of course, you're not going to learn this in the economics department in Jamaica or around the world, because they're telling you that we have to lower debt and all of that. And they do not contextualize what are the implications of lowering our debt and not pursuing policies of development. They won't tell you that. They're just going to give you this very narrow understanding of what, how an economy should grow and or should not grow. But we must understand that the US at this moment realizes that economically it is falling. And militarily it's still strong because it continues to what? To invest at the expense of its citizens huge amounts of money into the military, right? So we understand that America invests over $1 trillion in its military annually. That is an investment that equals it's more than all the nations of the world combined, more than all of the developed nations in the world combined. So that means, therefore, the United States invests more in its military than Russia does, than China does, than, India, than Japan. All of these powers or emerging powers combined, something that should boggle the mind. So the United States, even though it sees that it's weakening economically, but growing militarily, then it decides that it too has to grow economically. China is now doing better, if you look at the real economics, better than the United States economically, because it is the manufacturing hub of the world. China is the manufacturing hub of the world. Now, if the United States is still a capitalist nation, which it says that it is, how is it that it is not producing? And that China has emerged. China, which is a so-called communist nation, has emerged as the communist hub, the manufacturing, rather, I shouldn't say communist hub, the manufacturing hub of the world is something that you have to really ask yourselves. And are you thinking about these things, or are you sitting reading the New York Times, reading the Jamaica Gleaner, reading the Jamaica Observer, or the Financial Times and the Guardians and the BBCs of the world and think that you are informed? You have to look beyond what they're saying, because they're not really representing the truth. Now, I have read to you many times Chalmers Johnson, who is one of the greatest political scientists that the United States has produced. Great scholar he was. And he says here in his book, Sorrows of the Empire, right? The Sorrows of Empire, Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic. And this is on page 256. You can go and get that book, Sorrows of the Empire, Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic by Chalmers Johnson. He says here on page 256, George W. Bush, and maybe I should back up a little bit further to let you know what he was saying, in what context he was speaking of. During the 1990s, and he's talking now about Clinton, and he says that Clinton was a more effective imperialist than even George W. Bush and the Obamas and the Donald Trumps of the world. Well, he would not have lived to see Donald Trump, nor because he died in 2010. But during the 1990s, the rationales of free trade and capitalist economics were used to disguise America's hegemonic power. So they were talking about free market society that we're still, it's not free, but we are brainwashed to thinking about. We talk about in the economics department and all of this, you have to have macroeconomic stabilities and all of that's nonsense, and your debt has to be reduced significantly, even though you are not investing in your human resources or in the infrastructure of your country. But, that is how economics should run, right? That is what they tell us, and that is what students go to university and they preach, right? And they teach. Now, we have the main agents of this imperialism were Clinton's Secretary of Treasury, Robert Rubin, and his deputy, today President of Harvard University, Lawrence Summers. The United States ruled the world, but did so in a carefully masked way that produced high degrees of acquiescence among the dominated nations. So in other words, that the dominated nations just take it for granted that that is how it should be ruled and how it should be governed. So when you talk about the IMF imposing its austerity, yes, we have to reduce our debt, and people begin to rationalize and say, yes, the United States has to clean us up because we do not have the capacity to clean ourselves up. So we have to have our masters to the north to come and clean all of the developing countries up. The problem is now that that country, the United States, needs to be also cleaned up because economically it is running on great deficit, right? It has a deficit with almost all these nations around the world, including China. And that is why the United States does not seize now, it sees China as a threat. George W. Bush, by contrast, turned to a frontal assault based on the use of America's unequaled military power, which you find now that Trump is using. So you find now that Trump is using, and Bush used it too, to cement their economic power. So you don't want to do it, then we will invade you. Even before 9/11, the Bush administration had unveiled its what? Unilateral approach, did not say multilateral, had waged its unilateral approach to the world. This was before 9/11, before they even ever thought about going into Iraq, which you might say, well, they were justified because the United States was attacked. But here the author, who's a brilliant scholar, is suggesting that even before 9/11, the Bush administration had unveiled its unilateral approach to the world. It withdrew from important international treaties. The Bush administration. This is not the Trump administration we're talking about. This is not the Trump administration that we are talking about. We are talking about the system under which even the Bush administration was functioning in, right? Including those seeking to ban anti-ballistic missile weapons, control the emissions of greenhouse gases, and create a court to try perpetrators of the most heinous war crimes. Bush also proclaimed openly his adherence to a doctrine of preventive war, right? So that is what they're suggesting here. It is in spring 2003, right? That's the war on Iraq there. It affirmed that it no longer needed or cared about international legitimacy. Now, this is under a Bush administration, which Bush appears now to be anti-Trump because he thinks that Trump is actually, upending America's internationalism, its globalism, and its quest, I should say, to work with the rest of the world harmoniously. Well, that's not true because Bush did not, deal with the rest of the world. He did not believe in multilateralism as the media is actually lying. These policies, so we talked about the fact that he no longer needed or cared about international legitimacy, and this was under Bush, that it had become a power answerable only to itself, and that internal forces of militarism, and that the internal forces of militarism were dictating foreign policy. So militarism is what dictates the United States foreign policy. I repeat that. Militarism is what dictates the United States foreign policy. It is not diplomacy. So while they're suggesting to you that Trump is this devil and the others are great, right now that Trump is trying to get China out of the region, out of Jamaica, out of the region, people are saying that this is a Trump policy. But this is not Trump policy. This policy or these policies have been ongoing, I would argue, from, since after World War II. But the United States cemented it, solidified this militarism and this militaristic foreign policy after 9/11. Right? But these policies were already being hashed even before 9/11, if you are doing your reading. Right? The aftermath of 9/11 more or less spelled the end of globalization, right? So we see where the United States is not trying to live in a harmonious world. It wants a world that it controls. It should have, right, all of the dominion, right, in the world. And that is what the United States is pursuing. Now, there was this article that was written by by um by this gentleman here, and it's in Counterpunch. Counterpunch. I don't know if you read those, it's counterpunch.org. It's a migration, drugs, and tariffs, whether Biden or Trump, US's Latin American policy will still be contemptible, and was written by Roger D. Harris. And I think it was a very, very beautifully written article and very spot on. Now, while we're seeing what is happening in Panama, the United States is suggesting that to she wants China out of that Panamanian Canal, out of the Panama Canal. The United States desires to have investments that it seems that China is making in that canal to desist. That is what it wants. And along with it wants to have much more of a militarized presence in that area. Remember now, that's a very important area of the world. And that is why it was made. Because before that canal was built, the United States would have to do a lot of going around the world to get to a certain point in the region. Right? But when that Panama Canal was built and was captured and was, controlled by the United States, it was able to control the Pacific region, the Pacific Ocean, right? The Atlantic and the Pacific oceans. So we have to understand that. Now, the article here was written that it's a migration, I think I read the title before, with Donald Trump as the new US president. Pundits are speculating about how US foreign policy toward Latin America might change. And we have been hearing that, wow, it's going to change, and how Trump is going to be this novice. He's going to be someone who is totally different from his predecessors. And you believe them because you believe what you see. You don't read,